Those myths around looking to women and looking to the men to the side of you who are taking your power is usually part of the system of oppression to keep people focused not on the people who are actually doing the oppressing, but the people next door to you who are struggling to survive. But then we lead to like white communities or white men, especially those that end up being bound up with far-right movements, talking about what power do I have because I'm standing here and watching this black or brown person take my job. That's a narrative that gets drip-fed to them to control their reality.
This is Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children, and I'm your host, Jane Gilmore. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Wurundjeri people, and recognise that words alone are not enough to close the gap caused by invasion and colonisation. I ask you to join me in action as well as words in acknowledging this, by doing things like giving to Aboriginal legal services, or if you can't do that, reading, listening, or watching art, analysis and research produced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This podcast is a series of 6 episodes loosely based on my book, Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children. You don't need to read the book to listen to the podcast, although of course I would be thrilled if you did buy the book. If you're in Australia, I'd love it if you could buy it directly from my website, janegilmore.com, links in the show notes, because that helps me keep the lights on, but you can also get it at any online bookseller. For the book, I rewrote from a feminist perspective 5 traditional fairy tales: Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast. When I was writing the book, it became very clear that there were dominant themes in each of those 5 stories. This episode is about The Little Mermaid, which in the original story written by Hans Christian Andersen in the 1830s was religious allegory. It's about the rewards in the afterlife for women who give uncomplaining love and silence to the men who treat them badly. In the original story, the Little Mermaid lives underwater with her sisters and her father, the Sea King. She's fascinated by the people who live on land, and after watching them for a while, falls in love with the local handsome prince. She can't be with him while she's in her own mermaid body, so she makes a deal with an evil and ugly sea witch, because as we covered in episode 1, all the villains in fairy tales are wicked older women. The sea witch offers her a magic potion that will give her legs, but demands 3 things in return. First, the Little Mermaid must willingly embrace the curse that says every time she takes a step on land, it will feel like she's stepping on knife blades. Second, she must allow the sea witch to cut out her tongue so she'll never be able to speak again. And third, if the handsome prince marries anyone else, the Little Mermaid will die, soulless and alone. She's so desperate to live in the world above the sea with her handsome prince that she agrees to the deal. Without her voice, however, she cannot tell him what she gave up to be with him, so he doesn't know that she is actually self-sacrificing enough to be his princess. Instead, he falls in love with another beautiful princess and decides to marry her. The Little Mermaid is heartbroken, but of course remains silent. The Little Mermaid's sisters come to tell her that they have traded their hair to the sea witch for a cure. If she stabs the handsome prince through the heart on his wedding day and pours his blood onto her legs, her fishtail will come back and she can live again as a mermaid. The Little Mermaid decides that the handsome prince's life is worth more than her own and throws herself into the sea. As she dies, angels come to her and say that because she sacrificed her life for the handsome prince, she has the chance to become an ethereal being. And if she devotes herself to doing good but invisible deeds for humans for 300 years, she'll be allowed to go to heaven. They tell her that whenever she sees a good child who is, quote, the joy of his parents and deserves their love, unquote, the 300 years will be reduced by a day. But every, quote, naughty or wicked child, unquote, she sees will add a day to her sentence. And that's the end of the story. Disney, of course, added singing sea crabs, a happy ending, and they took out all the blood and mutilation, but essentially the story is the same. Yet another fun and instructive story for children. My guest for this episode is the wonderful Stephen Roberts, Professor of Education and Social Justice at Monash University. Being an expert in social justice and education gives him huge insight into the power of speaking and the disempowerment of silence. Steve, thank you so much for being here.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, what can you tell us about the power of having a voice?
Oh, gosh. Absolutely necessary, right? We know that not just to do with gender, but look at all the injustices around the world. The significance of voice in the private realm and the public realm is hugely important, like unbelievably important.
Who gets to have a voice in public life?
Yeah, well, I think historically, probably as we all know, women do not get to have as much of a public voice or a voice in the private realm as well, actually. So probably historically the kind of stereotype, but also the reality for hundreds of years is that men's dominance of the public realm has included having their voice here, there, and everywhere, and muting women's voices.
Yeah, it's a chicken and egg thing, isn't it? Do they have a voice because they have power, or do they have power because they have a voice? You can't have one without the other, can you?
Right, absolutely. They serve each other mutually, I think.
Yeah.
And one is kind of an expression of the other, right? Like the voice is an expression of that power that's given through social institution of masculinity.
If you were to be able to wave a magic wand over the universe, because we're talking about fairy tales here, what do you think could change it?
Oh, God.
We're going for the simple questions now.
Going for the simple questions. Well, from reading your book, I think getting the wish for Cinderella. I've forgotten her actual name that you give her. It's much nicer than Cinderella. Waving a magic wand and wishing for men not to be such bastards would be a good start. But actually, that's both. Like, I'm being kind of facetious, but not really, because I think one of the things that we struggle against and struggle to do because of the norms of patriarchy is to challenge men to do more. Like, I think that's what we're talking about, right? Will we ever get to a stage where enough men can be convinced to invite a person into the conversation? So there's this whole debate in feminist circles about like men need to get out of the way to allow women to lead the change, but men have also got to be part of the change. And I think that involves at the micro level being ultra conscious of making the space to give voice to another person and not saying like the boys do, but the men do it as well. I'm not stopping you. Like, there's an active process happening, which is so interesting given the whole passive active binary, that men are active, but they're actually not very active in making the space for a woman to speak and to excel.
Yeah. And I think also with that men get out of the way, it's often in reference to men get out of the way of women's work and women's spaces and women's voices. Have a voice, but go use it where it's needed, right, which is with other men.
Absolutely.
With other men, and particularly with boys who don't have those male role models that they need. Yeah. If you want to be part of the change, don't come into a room full of women and start telling them what to do, because that's not going to go very well. Yeah. Go and talk to the other men who, as you say, are sitting there passively, not knowing what to do, and they won't listen to women's voices. So they actually do need those male voices.
Completely.
So how do we get men to do that, to use their voice for that reason?
It's very tricky. Michael Flood, he's a professor at Queensland University of Technology, he often talks about how we have to recognize that there's something that men have to give up. They have to give up some power. And often the conversation is around, equality means everyone gets the same. And even equity in a way means everyone gets treated equally. But there is a reality that we have to recognize, that there is a giving up of power and privilege as well. And I think that proves one of the biggest challenges. But there are still rewards for everyone for giving up, which is a bit paradoxical in a way. But there are rewards not only for the women, but the men in those women's lives and the people of all genders in those men's and women's lives to be fairer. And I think it's like a common humanity thing. But how do we get people to understand that there is a reward from giving space to someone else is super, super difficult. Like, to cultivate empathy, which is, again, stereotypically associated with being a woman, with femininity in the first place, is difficult to wrestle people away from the opposite of that when they're told it to be a man. You have to be taking a space, So it's like there's something about transforming masculine norms, which will then allow men to be the people who are taking part in creating the change for everybody. But like, how does that change become rewarding when our first message has to also be, you're going to be giving up some social power here? It's very tricky.
And power is such a difficult thing to give up, particularly, I think, for men who are so used to having it that they don't really even notice it until it's gone.
Absolutely. And actually, that's probably pretty much most men, right? In some, like Raymond Connell talks about the patriarchal dividend that we all men, or probably, and even most people who identify as men, somehow get a reward from that. Even when you're at that, and that's why, white working class men, who are often considered to be the opposite, don't have any power. But of course, they have the power that patriarchy allows for them as well over typically working class women or black women. So there is power for all men. So all men have to realize that there is something to give up, even those men right at the bottom near the bottom of the social hierarchy.
It's difficult for those men because they, I think, often feel like they're being attacked from both sides, that they are losing power, they're losing economic power, they're losing political power, they're losing social power on one side to more educated, more professional, more ambitious women, and on the other side to what we would like to see, which is other men coming to them and saying, well, you have to give up this power because it's not doing you any good. It's hurting you. Let it go. And losing something is always a threat.
Yeah.
So the response to that threat often, particularly if you're buying into all those masculine gender norms, is, well, I defend it by attacking.
Yeah, yeah. And they're all, as we know, they're all kind of, again, as you said, all bound together. It's patriarchy and politics more generally.
Which again comes back to that power of voice, because that's that voice that they're hearing. That's the only voice they're hearing, is that all these black and brown people are coming to take your jobs and your power, and so you need to fight.
Thank you, Fox News and the like.
Yes, the evil empire. Yeah. Look, as much as I despise them, I think if it wasn't Murdoch, it would be somebody else.
Right.
Because that space had to be filled by someone.
Right. Yeah.
And it was just, it's now a Murdoch-shaped space. And somebody else will come along in the form probably of Lachlan Murdoch. But even if, again, our magic wand waved him away, I think that fear has to be given a voice. And so somebody who articulates fear, like Andrew Tate, who you and I have talked about before. For anyone who's listening, in case you don't know who Andrew Tate is, he's the jester king, current leader of the Manosphere, the one who puts into words how terrified, powerless white men are of women and of themselves and of each other, and says to all the young men in the world, it's okay as long as you're big and tough like me. You'll be fine. Put your credit card details in here and I'll sell you a cure for all your fears. But again, he has the following he has and the social power that he has because he filled a vacuum. And there's the power of voice again.
Absolutely.
Who is the voice that we would want all the tater tots to be listening to if it's not Andrew Tate?
I love that you call them tater tots, but that really made me laugh when I read that. Yeah, so it kind of speaks to this issue of male role models. But again, I think this is a bit of a construction. So I think Tate fills the void of male role models, but the absence of male role models is actually like a kind of right-wing sentiment in a way. Like it's a myth that I think is perpetuated by folks who say, oh, yeah, this is why there's no male role models. That's why Tate's so successful. But what he's voicing is the defense of patriarchy and the defense of a very particular form of masculinity and a form of male power, like the trying to hold on to male power in the face of what kind of progress we have seen in terms of the Me Too movement and so on. So I think it's not so much an issue of that we don't have anybody else to speak. There are plenty, and it's interesting because I think it does come back to voice, how we use it and who gets platform. But there are plenty of less, I don't want to say great men, but less bad men who could be constituted as role models. So like we've talked about this before, but like Chris Hemsworth, I think is an interesting character here. He's a Hollywood actor, like huge superstar, and Chris Evans as well. So the two Chris's in the big kind of Marvel universe, they occasionally have said stuff that's clearly a bit feminist. You know, they wouldn't, I don't know if they'd necessarily go out of their way to call themselves feminists, but there are plenty of men who, again, I don't want to call them great men. They're just less shit. So they are also role models. But then beyond that, mums can be role models, aunties can be role models, women on the TV can be role models. Now, that doesn't work well when you've got people like my daughter's boyfriend who says stuff like, I can't watch a movie that's got a woman lead because I can't identify with her. Like, it doesn't work for him. But actually, the research is really clear that people need role models who are good human beings, and they need a diverse array of role models. So I think, yeah, there's something to be said that, you know, we need men to be good role models for boys as well, because at the minute they're learning from bad role models like Andrew Tate.
So is it something to do with Andrew Tate deliberately talking to those lost, angry, vulnerable, insecure boys and men who are looking for somebody to talk directly to them? Like you just said that the Marvel Universe Chris's say something in passing, but they're not recording podcasts and making videos directly at that target.
Yeah.
Is that what the difference is using your voice directly to those young men?
I think so. I think there is like it's like a market, right? And he's got his big market share, and those other super famous guys, it's not in their interest. It's not their market. It's not really what they're doing. And I think the market language is really kind of swinging around my head now, because he clearly, as you have articulated elsewhere as well, he makes tons of money. It's his product, actually. And by design, he makes those boys and young men feel shit about themselves. And I've said this out loud in other forums, like he hates those kids more than anybody else does. It's kind of interesting that he kind of speaks to them makes them feel shame. And then ashamed about who they are, and then markets himself as a solution. Again, you get at this in your work, and I think that's really, really telling. So he's manipulated a perfect storm, and actually being very savvy, I suppose. If you want to look at his bottom line and see that he's got, if you're measuring the bottom line in terms of bank balance, then he's done the right thing, right? He's the right thing, air quotes here. Like he's been successful in manipulating an audience to give him money to solve the problem that is their lack of masculine power.
Yeah, he seems to hate men almost as much as he hates women.
I think so.
Weak men.
Yeah.
Weak men and
Absolutely.
strong women are what he's really railing against.
In a way, it doesn't surprise me, though, because the measure of masculinity has always been measured by other men. Like masculinity is always like the kind of pissing contest, you know? Like it's always about what does another boy think. There's lots of research in schools over the decades that shows that boys police one another more than girls will ever, more than the teachers will ever police them. It's about performing a particular style of boyhood and manhood that gets the validation of your peers.
Oh,
so
yeah.
he's got that, right? So he's looking down because he's disgusted by the subservient man, the beta man, as he would call them.
And he doesn't hide it at all.
No.
He's absolutely overt about if you are weak, if you are a coward, if you're not trying hard, and if you're not strong enough, if you're not man enough, then you should just die.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's something in that contempt that they're drawn to.
Yeah, I think because it's super complicated, but I think he touches on something that's very real, which is, but it's the problem of patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, all bound together. It's a problem of the world and the contemporary moment. Boys and young men are feeling lonely. There is, on average, like the statistics tell us that sense of loneliness and social disconnection and social isolation, those things are going up at the same time as we have increasingly challenging environmental as well, but the economic landscape is what I'm trying to get to. Probably lots of these kids are not even thinking about the environment, although lots of them are, of course. What am I talking about? They get into the streets of Melbourne and tell us what's what. Yeah, so the economic landscape is hostile, and it's hostile particularly to the tradition of what men used to be able to do. So the story of being able to go get a job after school and even after higher education and be a breadwinner. Like if people are being sold that story that that's what's desirable as a goal for a young man, but it's not possible. The gap between what's desirable and what's possible is a real thing, and it's a real problem. So I think that's what he's exploiting as well.
So do you think it's something that somebody with a voice that was not contemptuous of those men, of those young, vulnerable men, would somebody be able to go into that audience, do what he did and target that audience deliberately with a plan to replace contempt and shame with strength and respect? Would you be able to help them redefine masculinity to something that doesn't have to make them feel so shit about themselves?
I want to say yes, but I don't underestimate how difficult it is. So, and it's complicated as well. So one of the things that comes to mind for me is there are lots of people who work in positive psychology and positive masculinity kind of psychology who talk about how we should praise men more often. We should get into the space and
yeah, because they never get enough praise.
Right. Yeah. There's some, as far as saying it's complicated, I think there's lots of difficulties with that whole branch of social research. So I think they're trying to do that. They're trying to say, like, we don't have to make men feel bad, for example. But then I think, again, that buys into the trope that that's what we're all doing. I don't think we are doing that. It's Tate and Trump and others who tell those boys, as we just said, it's Tate that tells the boys that's, that they're pathetic or whatever, and they should be ashamed if they're not X, Y, Z.
Tate says far worse things about men and boys than I ever have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I like to think of myself as quite a rampant feminist.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there is... It sounds really awful, but there's something less sexy, and it's difficult to kind of penetrate that audience with a message of you're already doing good and you're already strong. Like the bad message is always the message that goes the furthest. I remember when I was a kid and was working in a supermarket, or whatever, like the basic kind of idea, and it's in research as well, but was always that you remember the negative experiences far, like with your customers, right? You always, and even as a customer, you always remember your negative experience far more than you remember the pleasant stuff. So there's a kind of, it's not very tangible, but there's a theme that runs through all parts of our life where that negative it's got more traction. It's sticky.
Yes. Yeah, you remember it more, you feel it more intensely.
Right. So exactly. So how that, like kind of that effective intensity, how do you get past that? How do you create an effective intensity around good without falling into the trap of, giving praise to boys when they already get plenty of praise and plenty of space and chance to use their voice all the time anyway?
Yeah. And then on the flip side of that, and I know you and Steph Westcott have done a lot of work on this, that when we do try and talk to boys in schools and universities about masculinity, so I've seen this a lot in schools, they'll get a masculinity speaker in after, I don't know, the boys have been rating the girls on spreadsheets or something like that. They get a masculinity speaker in to deal with the boys, and the girls are given the afternoon off or, told to go and do a baking class or make some jewelry or watch a movie, just have a nice time, go to the library and study. Like, these are genuinely things I've heard from girls in schools about what they do while the boys are having masculinity speakers. So again, that idea of voice is being reinforced. It's important that we talk to the boys. It's important that the boys talk to us. Girls go off somewhere else and talk to each other quietly when nobody can hear it. There's no idea of somebody coming into the school and saying, these girls have been hurt. They've been harmed, and they need to talk to us about how that happened, why that happened, and how it made them feel, and what we need to do to correct that for them. Because particularly in schools, the children, they're not adults. They don't have an adult responsibility to fix their adult's world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's so interesting. I think one of my PhD students a couple of years ago did a huge systematic review of these kind of interventions that come into schools. And one of the things she was looking at was the gender of the facilitator, but also the gender split of the classes. And they're often, as you described, like, let's target the boys and talk to the boys and not talk to the girls at all, as it turns out, let alone try and help them through their trauma. But the study, and there was not a lot of studies to prove this, but it's certainly in this direction, that mixed gender interventions are probably more useful, like to expose boys to the trauma and the shame that girls have to go through. And it's difficult because you don't want to have the girls have the labor of doing all of that. But certainly the idea that you need to separate the boys off and keep them over here and have another man come and talk to them is not necessarily the most effective, and actually just further reinforces and underscores those kind of gender differences.
That boys are the ones whose voices are important.
Absolutely.
Both in the speaking, having the power to speak, but also in everybody making sure they listen.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure, Steve, that you've really solved the problem here. And I want to know.
Just trying to keep myself in a job.
Well, I want to know, you've had like 45 minutes. Why haven't you solved a problem we haven't been able to solve for at least 10,000 years?
Yeah. It's, I should try harder, I guess.
Yeah.
I need a platform to give my voice the space to do it.
Do you think it's something that anyone has tried? Do you know of anyone who's actually tried to be that positive Andrew Tate and failed because they're not sticky enough?
I'm pausing because I think there's a lot of good work done by different types of advocates, but they have nowhere near the reach or the voice. So the work that, I've been critical of these types of programs before about their reach, but the work that those school intervention programs do, I think there's some value there. And some of those people that are in those spaces advocating in rooms where the policymakers are, like trying to make that voice towards normalizing positive masculinity. It's out there, but it's very it's not superficial. The work is deep, but it's not very widespread. And it certainly hasn't had the traction. Like I don't know there are many. Again, it's tricky, right? So there's this amazing YouTube channel by a guy called, I think it was called Charlie's So Cool or something like that. It's a teenage boy, and it was a few years ago. And I read the paper about a research paper about this, about how this young boy was repackaging and representing a way of being masculine that was much more in tune with what Gen Z boys and whatever the next generation is want and can do. So it was opening up possibilities. And yet at the same time, you've got all this kind of looks maxing type stuff that's like also starts off in a similarly innocent place. So there's this colliding forces and competition for what's possible in that space. So to go all the way back to the question, I don't know that there is anyone that's doing it really, really well in terms of their traction and in terms of how elevated their work is. There are pockets of good work.
Yeah, that fits with what I've seen as well. And I do think it comes back to that tapping into fear, because also when you go back to when Tate really took off, it was lockdown. He had his presence from the mad right-wing nutjob corners of the internet, but it was really during lockdown that he took off. And if he was the only one who had ever done that, I might say, oh, well, it was just the the awful stuff that we all went through in lockdown and they'll get over it. But men like Andrew Tate go back hundreds of years. There's just been a long series of them. He's just the most recent. And while he's probably got the biggest platform of any of them because of the reach of social media, he will inevitably disappear and the next one will come along, be that little bit more shocking, that little bit more disgusting, that little bit more outrageous to get attention, and will be the next big thing that we can't get past when we're trying to connect to those really vulnerable young men and boys, because it does seem to me it is the really vulnerable ones that he gets to, the ones that have that really strong sense of self-worth, find it easy to ignore him.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there are lots of boys that can ignore him, actually. Like the research really shows us that it's...
The majority of boys ignore him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So a significant minority can't get past it, and that's super problematic for the people that have to experience the behaviors of those boys, and probably for the boys themselves. Let's face it, all of the kind of bullshit that he subscribes to is the underpinning factors for higher suicidal ideation. So it's pretty fucking terrible. And I think I'm digressing a minute, but I'm just thinking again about how, like, yes, it's social media at a time of COVID, and there was a vacuum there, I suppose. And it, of course, coming a couple of years after the very kind of strong turn to post-truth as well. So you can just say what you want and they can reject expertise. So this is a nice confluence. But then at the same time, similarly, TikTok and algorithmic logic has played a huge part. And I'm thinking actually about that, its connection to voice. And when people think about, first of all, people often forget that algorithms are human made, of course. So they're human coded. So they can start to take a life of their own in some way. But what they elevate is controversy, because that's what gets you the clicks in the attention economy. So then when we just walk back a little bit, we know that the algorithmic structure is based on the same idea of like a masculinist idea of what should have voice, what should have platform. So I think there's something about going back to our magic wand, there's something about how the social media companies have got a role here, not just through, I don't know, whether we kind of legislate or try and hurt them in their pocket or whatever, but actually there's a design obligation as well that is not to follow those logics that are basically the foundation of the masculinist principle of having voice and raising the voice of the loudest, most obnoxious, most clickable person. Because, as we know, so in that window of time, we had lockdown, loads of boys and girls and all kids were at home instead of at school, more exposure to tablets and their devices or whatever. And they got more and more Tate, because that's what the algorithmic logic does to them. It feeds it into their feeds, whether they like it or not. So
and there was also the post-Me Too backlash wave that he rode into all their algorithms.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm sure you've seen the research out of, I think it's Dublin City University, about the researchers set up some phones. Yep. One phone did nothing. They just set them up as 16 to 18-year-old boys. One phone did nothing. One phone searched for Andrew Tate-like content, and one phone searched for gym and sports and how do I talk to girls. And all of them within 24 minutes were served really toxic Manosphere content. Yeah. And if they clicked on it at any point, it went to about 75% of their content, and about 10% of the content was right-wing conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, that's right. And really hostile stuff as well. Tate's hostile enough, right? But really like incel type, very violent kind of stuff, even more violent than Tate.
Yeah. When I was writing this book, I read Elliot Rodgers'
oh gosh, book. Poor you.
No, it was fascinating. I mean, awful, but he's talking of having a voice. He was quite articulate, and the grandiose murder fantasies happened at the end, but it wasn't really a manifesto. It was an autobiography. And when he was writing about his early childhood, he was writing about a loving family and wonderful people. He adored his mother and his grandmother. But when he was writing about his teenage years, particularly his early teenage years, he was describing a really deeply, painfully lonely, socially awkward, small teenage boy who was so desperate to be respected, but so devastatingly insecure that he felt he never could be. And he turned this into hatred of women because he blamed them for it. That women could have given him sex, which would have given him self-respect and the respect of others, but they chose not to. So therefore it was their fault and the fault of the boys that they did give it to. this ended horrifically with him killing people, shooting them, and then shooting himself. And he is the extreme. But that picture of him as a teenage boy that he explained so well because he lived it. I've seen that boy in so many classrooms, and that is the boy that Tate is targeting. That boy who doesn't feel that he has a voice, that he doesn't feel he has any power, that women have all this power because they are the dispensers of sex and love. It's, like a snack machine. You put in a coin and out comes the sex and love. And they choose who they give it to. And so that fear and hatred of people who can have that power over you is so strong that you say to a boy like him, oh, but you have power because you're a white man. And I can kind of understand why it's so difficult for them to believe and makes them so angry.
Yeah, completely agree. It's complicated stuff. Like there's no effort on Tate's part, obviously, but even others in that area of the internet and area of the manosphere, there's no effort to reimagine or even trouble masculine entitlement there. In fact, they reinforce it for the reason that Elliot Rodger and others like him feel like that is, again, because of the goals that are set as the markers of what is appropriate manhood. There's no other vehicle for esteem apart from wealth and women in that estimation, right? So what's really troubling is that we recognize it, that he feels lonely and his whiteness has not, and it's actually his privilege because from my understanding, he's a relatively privileged young man as well. He's not poor
his
white
mother
boy.
was Malaysian, I think.
Okay,
so
yeah.
he took on very racist attitudes towards African Americans and Hispanic Americans.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, there's never any logic in racism, so you can't say, well, he didn't follow the logical racism. Why didn't he do it that way,
But not poor as well, I think.
No,
right? Yeah.
no, not at all.
So the markers of esteem elsewhere, but the thing that was really valuable to him, the thing that was out of his reach, is this the ridiculous gender stereotypes of wealth. And I mean, wealth maybe he had, but women, right? Yeah, access to women, entitlement for access to women and sex was the thing that was driving him to violence ultimately, and the worst kind of violence. And so, but that idea that's propped up, the entitlement to that's propped up and never really challenged, that's so sad. It's really sad that this boy has completely internalized that story, that it's the lack of, air quotes again, access to women, access to sex, the entitlement that you don't get. That's what, tips someone over the edge. But it kind of makes sense because that's the story he's been told through media and through Andrew Tate's, predecessors for his whole life up until that point.
Yeah. And I think, we're talking a lot about men's voices in a episode where we're talking about women's voices.
Oh, no.
No, but there's a reason for that because it's why women don't get that voice, is that why women are so often shut out of having a public voice or denigrated when they try.
Right, yeah.
And those ideas of, oh, well, she's whining, she's complaining, she's shrieking, she's so angry. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've seen a fair few men in public life get pretty damn angry when they're speaking publicly and they're just passionate.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But women, when they get angry, are over-emotional.
All right.
I think it was Taylor Swift that said men react and women overreact.
Yes, nice, yeah.
That constant policing of the way women use their voice is done by men who hold these patriarchal attitudes, which is why we're talking about how do we change that so that then the next female Prime Minister of Australia doesn't have to worry about people policing her voice and her nose and her clothes and her shoes. And one article I remember finding when I was writing the Fixed It book, her earlobes.
Oh my God.
An entire article on news.com.au, I think it was, one of the Murdoch press outlets, about Julia Gillard's earlobes were not fit to be seen in public.
Oh my God, that's so bad. That's so bad. The stuff about being shrill as well, it's such an interesting vehicle for policing women. And I read a paper, it's a couple of years ago now, and it's outside of my area, but I remember thinking it was super interesting that women's voice tone has gone down over the years. So as women have moved into the public space, they've had to learn to have a slightly deeper register. Huh. So there's linguistics people that know much more about this than I do, but it's super fascinating, right? That they've actually change the way they speak because they know they'll be subject to the very things you're talking about, being told this pitch of your voice makes it clear that you're over emotional, makes it clear that you're not rational, makes it clear that you're shrill and whining or whatever. And that being a kind of long continuation of the thousands of years of patriarchy, as we've said, that has meant that, women might be policing their voice and changing their tone a little bit, but in some spaces, and probably actually still in some spaces, they don't say anything for fear of being killed, actually. Like using your voice is a huge risk as a woman, because you'll get called out in public. You might also get beaten up as well, or murdered.
Yeah, I remember doing some media training with some domestic violence survivors a few years ago, and one of them asked me how she could stop herself crying when she was telling her story in public. And I just remember looking at her thinking, why do you need to? Well, okay, no, I know why you need to stop yourself crying, because you will experience it as shame and other people will use it against you as a means of dismissing or denigrating what you're saying, the fact that you are being emotional. But my God, her story, how anyone could listen to it and not cry, let alone tell that story and not cry, was stunning to me. And I gave her the tricks that I knew because she asked me to, but it really struck me that we ask women who have survived all kinds of trauma to be that voice, to go out in public and tell their story, because we need to have the voices of people who've actually just managed to survive those kind of experiences, because apparently you can't just tell men that rape is bad, you have to describe how it's bad.
As you're saying this, I can't get out of my mind just the news headlines from France at the moment. Absolutely terrible. That situation where that poor
Giselle
woman,
Pellico.
Yeah, she's amazing. Like she's incredible. But there's the same thing that she's having to come forward and use her voice in a way that demonstrates this is real. It's a problem. You know, did you know that tens and tens of men lining up to rape my unconscious wife was a problem? Oh no, it's not a problem until you hear her say how bad it is
and describe it and let people see the videos of it, and even then. Obviously, I don't read French because I grew up in Australia where we only do one language. But I've certainly read translations and read reports of the lawyers in the case are still saying, are you sure you weren't asking for it? And some of the commentary in France is still, well, how do we know she wasn't asking for it? And this is a case where the man who arranged for 70 men to come into his house and rape his women has admitted it. Has said in court, I did this, she didn't know, they knew, I'm testifying to that, and I have video evidence of it. So again, that idea that women's voices are not trustworthy is fascinating. That you and I were talking about Matthew Hale earlier today. Matthew Hale was a Puritan, a judge, a witch burner, and a few other things that I suppose I can't really get sued for defamation. He died in the 1600s. But he was responsible for putting the corroboration rule into common law precedent, which meant that judges had to tell juries, were actually obliged to tell juries in rape trials and child sexual abuse trials that they could not take the word of a woman or child who were saying that they had been abused unless it was corroborated by a man. And that followed common law into Australia. It was in, I think it was Western Australia was the last one to get rid of it. I think I might have to check that. But it was in the 40s or 50s. It was within the last 100 years that rule was finally eradicated from our justice system. So we're not talking back in the dim, dark ages here. And that idea that women's voices can't be trusted. They are not trustworthy witnesses to their own experiences, let alone the ideas of other people or public debate. And I don't think that myth has been as eradicated as we would like to believe.
I completely agree. It's so horrible. And yeah, it's such a constant, like such an absolute constant that, and sort of, again, simultaneously paradoxical, but actually it just shows you what a weapon of patriarchy is, and how women hatred is just so seeped into our culture that women are on the one hand in those kind of really, really problematic binary formations of gender. Like women are kind of pure and fair and honest and truthful, actually, but then not truthful, actually, because at the same time they can never be trusted. Like it's impossible to be a woman, as you all know much better than I do. Yeah, there's no way out.
A lot of those fairy tale stories, the fairy tale princess, one of her defining characteristics is unselfishness, the self-sacrifice. I love doing all your domestic labour just because it makes me happy, that kind of attitude. Is there a connection between that self-sacrifice and that requirement for what we call unselfishness, but really means anything that you want or desire for yourself or for your future is something that you ignore in favour of serving others? Is there a connection between that and having a voice?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's all bound up with a bunch of different binaries that are connected to what women and men in a binary model, what women and men should be, like femininity, masculinity, loud and quiet, seen and not heard in the case of women. Yeah, I think it's connected, but it's connected to this idea that women should be caring, I think, as a start. So they should care about others. They're like other-centric. That's where we start from in terms of like the ethos and theory of care. That the carer is kind of active, but they're active for the service of others, whereas men kind of are more individualist, and more ego-driven. And these things are given to us as if they're real as well. They're inherent somehow. That's what men are like. Women love to care. They love to care about others. They love to do servitude because you're doing femininity when you do servitude.
Yeah. And it's almost like the reverse, that if you're doing masculinity, it's, we call it the opposite sex for a reason. You have to be the opposite.
Right.
To be a masculine, you have to be the opposite of feminine.
So back to voice, like the servitude of a communication is the listener, right? So
right.
And I think women are expected to listen to men's problems. Actually, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but the other night I was watching Love is Blind with on Netflix with my sister-in-law who'd never watched many of them before. And she said, isn't it interesting how the men are just like talking so much? Like the men just keep chatting about it and the women are like listening.
Yeah, I see that happen in not just primary school, but in preschools, where the boys will be praised for being loud and for saying what they want and for talking and articulating themselves, and the girls are praised for being quiet and gentle. Aren't you a good girl? Mm-hmm. And when the boys are saying things and they're loud and often they're funny and they're not being overtly aggressive, they're just being big and taking up lots of space. And it's praised in boys.
Yeah, gosh, that's so interesting and troubling. As with everything in your book, I'm thinking about how does this reflect in my real life? So I've been recently thinking about my son who's 6, and he is often these days saying, is this funny? Like when I'm laughing at him, he's enjoying that recognition of being loud. And my wife and I are kind of struggling with how much praise is too much praise for these things. Are we, putting him on this track to be a dominant, loud boy, but we don't want him not to be praised for saying something, right?
Yeah.
But it's constantly thinking about where the hell are we sending this kid and what's he going to be like with his women peers, his girl peers. And particularly when it comes to voice and loudness versus quietness and rewarding with laughter when he's being funny. And as you said, like that kind of reinforcement happens in the school setting often. So I'm conscious of that. And I think it's a difficult balance for parents.
Yes, because at the same time, you don't want to try and correct the balance by taking away his power to speak and have a voice, because that's also important.
Absolutely. And that's been front and center of my mind as well. He's a quiet child, actually, in lots of ways. So seeing him begin to feel confident to express himself is what we want. But I'm also conscious of it's actually not to do with voice, but he is starting to talk about gender differences as well, and has been for a year or so. He actually has quite long hair, which I'm very pleased about, because for a while he had started to say girls have long hair, boys have short hair. So these kinds of things about the binary invention and the kind of subscription to the binary happens quickly.
Yeah, I was in I think it was grade 5, grade 6 classroom a while ago, and we were talking about consent, and one of the girls was they're all sitting on the floor, and one of the girls was sitting hunched over with her head down, just drawing patterns on the carpet with her finger, and one of the boys was talking a lot, and he was right in what he was saying, and he was insightful and funny and articulating the concepts really well. So it wasn't right to tell him to stop or tell him to be quiet, but at the same time we had to find a way to give other kids in the class room to speak. So I asked him to shush and let this girl talk, and he just looked at me with this blank look on his face and said, but I'm not stopping her talking. She never says much anyway. And I thought, that's so typical. I have heard that from so many men and boys like him who are well-intentioned and I think a really kind, generous boy. But I remember working in the energy industry about 20 years ago, and I was almost always the only woman in any room I was ever in. And occasionally I would say to the guys, hey, can you let me talk? And they'd have that same look on their face of, but I wasn't stopping you talking. What? I don't understand. And it's hurt and a little bit resentful is the response, because to them, they're just being normal. And it is also normal in their world for women and girls to say less and talk less and not interrupt them and not insist on equal time and equal space.
Absolutely. And they're following a masculine imperative. So they imagine that if you want to talk, you will talk, because they have an entitlement to talk. So those that are permitted to talk kind of take that entitlement and launch with it. So they're kind of surprised if I'm not stopping you. You can say whatever you want. But as a woman and as a girl, you're taught so often in those millions of micro ways, Wait for your time to speak, wait to be invited to speak. And I think in those scenarios that you're describing, those boys and men were probably not inviting anyone else to speak, actually.
No, because I think in their perspective on the world, they didn't need to.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that little boy saying to me, but I wasn't stopping her.
Mm-hmm.
And that bewildered look on his face, he meant that. He wasn't stopping her in his mind.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I think it was Dale Spender in the 70s, maybe early 80s, did a study with her university students. Dale Spender was the author on what I think was the first feminist book on linguistics.
Mm-hmm.
And she did this study with her university students where she had a group discussion and then she asked them to measure how much they thought the other gender was talking. And meanwhile, she'd been actually taking notes. And
Yes.
this experiment has been replicated so many times over the years, but I think she's the first one I've been able to find who recorded it. And the boys thought that it was equal when it was about 30%, and that when it was equal that the girls were talking all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They thought that the girls were interrupting them more when in
Yes.
fact it was about 70% the
Yes.
boys were interrupting. And they also perceived more hostility from the girls when the girls did interrupt them than they did from when the other boys interrupted them. Now, as I said, these have been replicated over and over again, and you don't even have to do a scientific study to replicate that. You just have to sit in a mixed group. But it's interesting that it hasn't changed much in 50 years.
Yeah.
That from that first study that I was reading by Dale Spender to that classroom I was in a couple of months ago, the same dynamics are still there, and we think we've come so far.
Yeah.
And who gets to have a voice and say what they think in the way that they want to? I want to be funny about it. I want to be quiet about it. I want to be insightful about it. I get to choose. That still seems to be centered on men.
Definitely. There's such policing of gender norms still. Absolutely. So even when we get representation in boardrooms, for example, we get more women in boardrooms than we used to. But you're right. Like whether or not they're being given permission and space to talk hasn't changed at all, really. It's, interesting.
So we've only talked mostly about gender so far, but we know that patriarchy and capitalism and white supremacy and homophobia are all just different tentacles on the same octopus.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can separate them when we're thinking about who has the power to have a voice and what they have to talk about? I'm thinking of, I think it was Noel Pearson doing a series of lectures about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And he was talking about their opportunities to have public voice and said it would be really difficult for an Aboriginal man to go to university and study Shakespeare with the intent of becoming an advocate or an actor or a lecturer on Shakespeare. Because if you're an Aboriginal man and you go to university, you're expected to study Indigenous studies and then become an advocate for Indigenous people. And that really struck me. And I was like, oh, look, there's another moment of racism in myself that I hadn't noticed before. Because, yes, I had just assumed that because I'm white and I grew up in white Australia. So that idea that an Aboriginal man might want to have a public voice about Shakespeare rather than having a public voice to advocate for First Nations people is also part of that constraint on who gets to have a voice and what they get to have a voice about.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. I'm going to go in a kind of wild different direction, but and I don't know the person necessarily, but I think it's the same with sports, right? That we imagine that queer men, for example, shouldn't be allowed to talk to the significance, and actually women shouldn't be allowed to talk to the significance of what's happening on a football pitch because it's not embedded with the stereotype of their gender. So yeah, I think that there are lots of examples of that where these stereotypes really kind of just dominate completely. And then going back into the university sector, I think that not just what people go to study, but what they do in their work. So I definitely have Aboriginal colleagues who are doing all the good work of bringing First Nations issues to the fore. And the route they take is, the management route into the center of the university, and they will become, doing very important jobs, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Indigenous, and so on and so on. But I've actually talked to a bunch of people who say the same thing as this, they don't want to talk about Shakespeare, but they want to talk about something else. I actually have colleagues who will deny their indigeneity because they know they will be pigeonholed. They'll be asked to do the labor that's often put on Black and brown and Indigenous people and women that they don't necessarily want to do. They don't want to be the equity person. They want to study early childhood. They want to study how people learn, but instead they have to become advocates and experts in the very thing that they are. But they don't get permission to speak to other issues.
Which is, again, that aspect of having a voice,
For sure,
almost a feeling of, well, we've given you a platform to stand on and you have a public voice, but you can only use it for this.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's probably a good note to end on. Thank you so much for coming in, Steve. I really appreciate your time and your perspective.
Thank you.
That was episode 4 on The Little Mermaid, The Power of Having a Voice, with my marvellous guest, Steve Roberts, Professor of Education and Social Justice at Monash University. Don't forget, if you want to buy the Fairytale Princesses Will Kill Your Children book, you can get it direct from my website if you're in Australia, or from your preferred online bookseller anywhere else. Come back next week when we'll be talking about Beauty and the Beast, which is obviously the script for Coercive Control, with Jess Hill, best-selling author of See What You Made Me Do.
Once you've heard these stories a few times, you can pretty much finish the next person's story before they're halfway through telling it. Or at least say, and let me guess, then next he did this, and then next he did that. You know, essentially the way that coercive control starts is always through the establishment of trust.